let's discuss for a few minutes the myths, simplifications, and conventions surrounding the Cold War, which, like any significant event in history, gives rise to many interpretations. The term Cold War is actually the result of a funny translation error. Nobody knows exactly when it was first used. However, it is known that this combination of words was previously used to denote the confrontation between Christianity and Islam in the Middle Ages, although then it was not called cold, but air plus cool or even warm. In the comments, we urge linguists to choose the most appropriate translation of English. The words tapped or the Spanish tibio. The adjective cold in its modern sense became widely used as a result of a mistranslation of the works of Don Juan Manuel in the 19th century, and this interpretation took root throughout the 20th century. The term Cold War was used to describe Hitler's actions in the 30s, and the definition spread, perhaps due to the influence of George Orwell. This is the first and most significant myth with which the Cold War is often associated. In different sources, the Cold War is presented in various contexts as a confrontation between dictatorship and democracy, capitalism and socialism, the plan against the market. There are dozens and hundreds of definitions, but they are all wrong. The Cold War was a confrontation between the US and the USSR, and this is the first and most significant myth. However, the US had no problem doing business and allying itself with Communist China in the second half of the 1970s. The USSR also found common interests with capitalist France and Israel. The economic system and other aspects were used primarily for propaganda purposes. In fact, both sides were willing to use various methods and allies to achieve their goals. The classic example is the action of both sides after World War II. According to the disclosed documents, the US recruited 743 German war criminals, including former Albanian Interior Minister Jafar Deva, who deported Jews and other unacceptable people to German concentration camps during World War II. Even though Jafar organized an entire SS division called Skanderbeg, this did not stop him from working for the US after 1945 in an attempt to overthrow the Albanian government. In addition, America supported many dictatorial regimes in South America, including the most famous of them, Augusto Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, who officially killed about 3,000 people in concentration camps, according to historian Nicholas Davis. During the Cold War, the U.S. directly supported at least 35 dictatorships around the world, while the USSR also supported dictatorships including Cuba, Grenada, and Venezuela. Both camps were opposed to each other, but neither of them objected to cooperation with visible ideological rivals if it contributed to a common goal. For example, in 1966, Brezhnev signed an agreement with the capitalist Fiat to build an automobile plant in Tolyai, which already in the 70s was producing 500,000 cars a year. The USSR imported steel from Japan, and West Germany was one of the main trading partners of the Soviet Union. Thus, ideological opposition during the Cold War was not the only factor, and both camps were willing to cooperate with visible ideological rivals if it contributed to a common goal. The USSR and the USA also did not shy away from cooperation with each other. The notion of the Cold War as a continuous conflict that began after World War II and ended in 1991 is incorrect. In the aftermath of Stalin's death and a brief power struggle, Khrushchev, the new leader, proclaimed a policy of thaw. He eliminated Stalin's personality cult and called for mild liberalization. In 1957 and 1959 there were mutual exhibitions of achievements of the USA and the USSR, and there were official meetings, including meetings with Nixon. Official documents from the United States referred the USSR not to opponents, but to competitors. The thaw period lasted 12 years, and if it seems to you that this is a short period, remember what your life was like 12 years ago. The second period of facilitating relations in Russian language literature is usually called détente. In the late 1960s, After the achievement of nuclear parity and Brezhnev's good relations with his U.S. colleagues, a new thaw began. In 1968, an agreement was reached on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and in 1975 an act of cooperation in Europe was signed in Helsinki. In 1972 and 1979, the U.S. and the USSR signed two strategic arms limitation treaties. In practice, the two blocs agreed to stop the race, at least in the nuclear realm, and to reduce the intensity of building nuclear bombs. At that time, there were many local and not very conflicts in the background, but in general, relations between the USA and the USSR from 1969 to 1979 were quite stable, and relations with Europe were excellent. Even when in 1979 the USSR sent troops to Afghanistan and received many sanctions from the United States, Europe refused to support these sanctions and continued cooperation, to which the USSR responded positively, despite the ideological confrontation. In general, the Cold War is more like a layer cake of periods of exacerbation and thaws, so it is incorrect to call all 50 years after World War II one big conflict. However, the end date of the Cold War is also a matter of controversy. Traditionally, it is associated with the collapse of the USSR, but in fact the Cold War ended when the USSR still existed. Officially, its end was secured by the signing of the Paris Charter for a New Europe on November 21, 1990, but it was more of a formality. In fact, the confrontation between the blocs ended already in 1987, when Gorbachev launched a policy of new thinking, and the Warsaw Pact countries published an exclusively defensive doctrine. On December 8, 1987, Gorbachev signed an agreement on the elimination of medium and short-range missiles, and the Soviet army was purged of Cold War fanatics. Society began to rebuild. The collapse of the USSR has nothing to do with the Cold War. It's just that events happened so quickly that when reading, they often merge into a single whole. Let's talk about a sad fact. In most people's minds, the Cold War is synonymous with a difficult, stressful, but still peaceful period. From time to time we use this wording, stating that the alleged huge amount of nuclear weapons in the US and the USSR prevented a global catastrophe, and the second half of the 20th century was peaceful because of this. Unfortunately, in practice, the Cold War cannot be called a period of stability. According to our calculations, from 1945 to 1970 there were 176 wars on the planet. Some of them, such as the conflict in Burma, continue to this day. Ruthless statistics show that in the second half of the 20th century people became even more militant. The pink dots on the graph represent military conflicts, and it is clear that in the 18th century an anomaly occurred with humanity, and they fought not so actively. However, the 20th century looks like a colander, and both the absolute and relative indicators of wars were at a historical maximum, far exceeding those of the bloody Middle Ages. If we look at the graph of deaths in wars, in 1989 and after the end of the Cold War, the graph did decrease, but only at the level of the thaw of the 50s. A real decrease in military activity was observed only after 2000. By that time, the Cold War was long over, and it no longer affected the statistics. In general, statistically it cannot be said that peace has come. Mankind simply managed to avoid a nuclear catastrophe and use it as a victory. But let's talk about the term Third World countries, which has already become hackneyed. Now it continues to be used in relation to weak states with a low level of development, without understanding its true meaning. It appeared during the Cold War and divided states according to their belonging to political blocs. And there are several classifications. In the United States and its allies, the countries of the First World called themselves and their allies, the countries of the Second World, the USSR, and the countries of the Third World, neutrals and everyone else. In China, the USA and the USSR were called the First World as two giants. The Second World, Japan, Canada, and other players of the Cold War, and the Third World, China, India, Africa, and other countries. It is important to understand that neither the American nor the Chinese classifications had a specific meaning. It was an honor for the Chinese to be the Third World, as the first two symbolized oppression and attempts to undermine the planet. Indeed, geopolitically the Third World was important, since new allies could be pulled out from there. Currently, the classification has mutated into a division according to economic characteristics, and few people know what the Second World is. The Third World is called backward countries, but this is outdated and erroneous terminology. Therefore, we must get rid of it. It is also worth getting rid of thinking about the Cold War as a worldwide conflict. Yes, the confrontation between the US and the USSR affected the whole world. The non-aligned movement was founded in 1961 and included states that did not want to join blocs and play the role of vassals. At present, it covers almost all of Africa, the Middle East, as well as India, Southeast Asia, and a significant part of Latin America. These states, among other things, are inhabited by half the world's population, just as it was during the Cold War. It's just that their actions don't get as much coverage, and that's why textbooks rarely mention the non-aligned movement. However, it should be recognized that it is one of the participants in the Cold War, because, as practice has shown, sometimes doing nothing is the best solution.